want to, there's a thing there popping up saying that we're filming this. So if you don't want to be that, please just turn off your camera and listen along. We'll be keeping the audience muted throughout, but we welcome all comments and questions. If you've been to any of our previous sessions, the comment box has been beautifully lively. And then from that chat box, I'll take some questions and I'll keep some time at the end for dealing with your questions. And in the meantime, do use the chat box to introduce yourself. It's really nice for us to see where people have come from, and we'll add a little Padlet, a link to a Padlet, which is a nice little space for you to network online, which is just something that we can do in the absence of face-to-face events. We'll also be linking to a feedback form, as we always have to prove our own worth, so that we can keep doing these wonderful things. So I'm very, very grateful if you can fill that in. Okay, so today we are looking at, the theme of the week is media and celebrity. Today we are looking at the relationship between media, celebrity and access to power. So this event is called Who Runs the World? Girls' Leadership and Women in the Public Eye. And this is named after a research project I've been working on for some time with my colleague, who you'll see here, Michele Paule, my colleague and my comrade. So Dr. Michele Paule, who, as well as being senior lecturer in media and culture here at Oxford Brookes, was elected last week as Labour councillor for Rose Hill and Littlemore. So congratulations, councillor. She and I have been conducting research with teenage girls around the whole country to ask how they feel about the treatment of women in the public eye and whether they imagine themselves in these kinds of visible positions of power in the future. So Michelle's going to briefly share some of these findings, and then we are incredibly lucky to have experts from media policy and production with us to talk about the role of policymakers, producers, and just general media gatekeepers in addressing these issues of what deters the potential women leaders of the future. And armed with our knowledge from our conversations with girls, what we can do to address the gender leadership gap. So on the policy side, we have Ruth Wye from the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport. And from the world of media production, we have Faraz Osman, Managing Director and Executive Producer from the TV production company Goldwalla. Ruth and Faraz, do you want to very quickly introduce yourselves as well to give our audience a little more sense of what we do? And then I've got some questions for everybody. So maybe Ruth first.
Sure. Hi, it's really great to be here today. I'm Ruth Wye and I head up a team that looks after advertising policy at DCMS. We're situated within the media and creative industries team, which looks after all sorts of things from sort of TV and broadcast policy through press regulation, but also in kind of championing and looking after the creative industries and creative economy within the UK, because we recognise in government that it is one of the kind of key and most important sort of growing service economies in the UK, and one that we want to look after. There are also lots of sort of regulatory kind of challenges around that, and one of the things we look at in our advertising policy is sort of a triangle really between society, individuals and business, in terms of making sure that we're looking after all those different interests. And one of the things that my team has been looking at putting through most recently is new restrictions on high fat, salt and sugar advertising, which isn't directly relevant to this, but is a sort of a harm, if you like, that we're trying to manage in government.
Thanks, Ruth. And is it all right if I say that before working in the field in an area of advertising, you also worked on press regulation and regulation of the internet? So a really well-rounded kind of perspective on lots of different aspects that really affect this issue.
Absolutely, and I would just say I'm a civil servant, so I'm sort of non-political, but we work for the government of the day. I'll do my best to sort of cover off some of these points, but I would just point out that sort of at the moment my sort of policy expertise is more in the sort of advertising space. I've got historical knowledge of what happens in other areas and should have some interesting thoughts, but they might not be 100% sort of the government position, if you like, just to put that sort of rider on the conversation.
Very good. Okay, Faraz, do you want to tell us a little bit more about what you've been doing?
Hello, yeah, so I'm Faraz. I run, as Hannah so eloquently put, a production company called Goldwaller. It's actually my second production company. Previous to that, I was running another company called Lemonade Money, which principally was doing stuff in the music space, in the popular music space. And before that, I was working in commissioning at Channel 4. I think in the kind of space that we're in right now, we've actually ended up doing a lot of programming and formats based around identity, particularly for younger audiences, so children and teenagers and young adults. And I think we're kind of getting increasingly interested in how this generation of viewers are particularly keen on not just seeing themselves reflected on screen, but having otherness celebrated in a way that for a long time and in generations of particularly TV previously, it was very much about the kind of status quo being the same. But I think that the kind of space that we're in right now, we're seeming to get a little bit more success by looking for new voices and new talent that certainly either says something different or at the very least looks and behaves differently. So that's it's a really actually quite exciting time in the media and content space, and it has been accelerated and fueled by what's happened with the internet, both for good reasons and bad reasons. But I think for a kind of younger, smaller production company like ours, for us to compete in what is quite a crowded market, we are very much seeing that identity and points of difference that can be celebrated and uncovered is something that we can bring as a kind of point of difference to allow us to grow and hopefully win more work and tell more stories. I should say the majority of work that we do is in the factual space. So we have done a few bits and pieces in scripted, but we tend not to do comedy and drama, which obviously has a lot different process that gets things to air. I mean, I have many opinions, as I'm sure Hannah has heard over the time around representation on screen, but when it comes to actually my professional work, the vast majority of it is in the kind of factual space and, for want of a better phrase, real people, as opposed to scripted characters and dramas.
Lovely, thank you, Faraz. And so Michele, would you like to just briefly introduce yourself and in the process, briefly share some of the key findings from the project that we've been working on together? What did the girls say? And also, I think a key thing to cover off is what do we mean by the gender leadership gap, just for everyone who's not already having that conversation. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, this is, I read something somewhere saying that Zoom is like a seance. Are you there? I can't hear you. I can't see you, you're blurry. So just to give you a bit of background about me, in the girl power age in the 1990s, before I was an academic, I was a secondary school teacher. And I think anybody working in schools in the 90s noticed that that was a period in which girls were enormously celebrated in terms of girl power. Their exam results started to overtake those of boys. There were enormous predictions that, you know, women were going to take over society. They were entering university in huge numbers. But that sort of wasn't matched up by what girls and women were going on to achieve. And I got very interested as I moved to academia. I actually moved through doing a PhD looking at high achieving girls and how the stories they were telling about themselves and were hearing about themselves were kind of very bound about. And that PhD led to a project working with the World Association of Girl Guides and Girl Scouts, who had noticed again what they called a kind of an ambition deficit. And so I worked to do action research across 3 countries in Europe and was recognizing some of this, but became very interested in how many girl-focused initiatives turn the energy back on the girl rather than on the culture that gives her the lessons. So if there is a lot of negative media, train the girls how to respond to it rather than. So we got very interested, particularly because Hannah works in celebrity and I work around kind of girls and culture, in the sudden rash of new kind of campaigns that were very much addressing girls in Western cultures, as opposed to those kind of Nike girl effect, you know, invest in the girl and she'll save the world in terms of the third world economy. That was spreading out to Western girls. If you think of that fearless girl statue in Times Square, is it in Times Square in Wall Street, as though kind of a 10-year-old girl can face down the raging bull of the markets. The Lehman Sisters hypothesis that suggested if you brought a bit of girliness into banking, the crash wouldn't have happened. So we're somehow kind of supposed to save capitalism, save the world. And the problem was, as Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In constantly expressed, there was an ambition leadership gap. And nobody seemed to be talking to girls about this while sending out lots of things called Ban Bossy and Here's a Book of Leaders and whatever. So Hannah and I thought it might be quite a good idea to go and talk to some of them and find out what they thought about this. And some of our, I think, impressions were confirmed, but the wonderful thing about doing research with young people is that whatever expectations you go in with, they're going to blow them up and expand them and take you to all kinds of new places. I'm particularly going to concentrate on the findings that seem to me we're talking a lot about representation, creative industries here. So I'm going to focus on that. So a lot of these kind of role model solutions, which suggest gender avenger, if she can see it, she can be it, would suggest that simply exposing girls to more women in the public eye will encourage them to want to be leaders. And we didn't find that at all. And that's partly because those messages conflict with every other social message and cultural message that girls are continuing to receive about keeping quiet and being good and etc. But also because the way in which women in the public eye experience that life is so negative. The sexism, the focus on appearance, the relentless judgment, and that is borne out by lots and lots of studies that we know. And we only have to look at the experience, for example, of Diane Abbott. And where, as we know, being a woman intersects with class or intersects with any kind of minority, that is so highly sort of ramped up. So that was one of the first findings that we found that we'll be talking more about. The second one is that when we're talking about these role models, we might decide what are the good and the bad role models for girls, but they have very, very different ideas. There's a lot of kind of social anxiety about around girls admiring celebrities, but we actually found that they were not drawing much distinction between celebrities and political leaders. It was rather what they saw them as standing for than what they'd done. We found that really any kind of racial specificity, blackness in particular, was erased in talking to lots of girls unless they were black girls. So Michelle Obama was the most admired figure among all our girls, white girls and black girls, but it was only the black girls really that talked about her race in any way. It was as though, and that accorded with a lot of research which talks about successful girls having to kind of disavow racism and make it about their own success. They want relatable and authentic people in place. So the idea is just because somebody's a woman, it's not, oh, she's a woman, I'm a girl, I can do that. They want, you know, girls from Bradford want to see leaders from Bradford. Black girls want to see black women. At the same time, the ways in which they allow themselves to desire power are very limited. And the other thing, which isn't really, I think, so much a job for media and representation, but it made me think about, I'm really into 2 TV programs at the moment. One of them is Line of Duty, obviously, and the other one is The Good Fight. And I was sitting watching those and thinking, I grew up in the 70s in the era of sort of Z cars and Ironsides, how completely and utterly impossible this would have been to see these women lawyers and these sort of women characters and this kind of complexity. And what girls lack is experience, exposure. The whole kind of leadership thing needs demystifying. And the final one is nobody's talking to them about the pleasures of power. I discovered this at 51 when I first became a councillor on a majority council. It's great. Nobody had ever told me this. I'd no more have thought about being a councillor in my 20s or 30s than I would have thought of flying. And I think there is something about the ways in which women wielding power, not only in the real world, but in the fictional world, that it always carries an extra emotional load for women, and girls really recognise that. So I kind of hope that was simple enough. It's so, in a nutshell, it's not just about showing girls more women in power, it's how those women in power are represented seems to make it a really big difference.
Thanks, Michelle. We seem to have lost Ruth. I don't know if that's a connection issue, but we've shared our executive summary. I've put it into the chat box, and Faraz, we shared it with you in advance. Did you have any kind of responses that you wanted to share at this point, both to what Michelle's just been saying and the findings of the project?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a really important piece of work. It is slightly depressing that we're still having this conversation. I mean, my sense is I come at it from a number of different angles. You know, one being a father of a young girl, obviously running a business, and then obviously running a business within the creative space as well. And all of those things give different perspectives, and I think responsibility as me as a man along the way. I think that from my from an industry perspective, and from in relation to the actual executive summary itself, I think it's clear that creative industries and celebrity culture, so, you know, music artists, presenters, actors, etc., they all seem to be doing a little bit better. We're getting a bit more recognizable gender equality in those spaces. I mean, you know, obviously we've had No Man Land, although I will come on to that separately. But we seem to be getting, like, you know, the big pop stars, the big actors, they all seem to have a little bit more parity when it comes to recognizable faces, and you know, the names like Adele and Rita Ora and Stacey Dooley, etc. Those are all kind of like big primetime box office names across the broadcasting spectrum. But my sense is that a lot of that is to do with like their personalities. So we are kind of drawn to them because of their personalities, and obviously the Kardashian effect around this as well. It's a bit like, oh, they're not really seen as, I don't think they're really seen as business people. They're seen as models first. They're seen in their kind of female form first, and then their business leadership is almost secondary. And I don't think it's a coincidence that a lot of those names that I mentioned also have modeling contracts, or also kind of fashion spaces in the fashion world. They have their own kind of fashion diffusion line, be they a presenter or whatever. They're all signed by L'Oreal. They're all kind of got their own makeup line, etc. It's all about their femininity that is connected to their identity, rather than just the fact that they are an actress in the same way that a male actor or a male presenter might be. I still haven't seen lots of male presenters advertising hair dye or shaving products or etc. And I think it's just the par for the course that if you become a successful female presenter, you will get a deal with a makeup brand or a clothing brand very, very quickly. So I think that they're kind of like the actual physical female form is almost still a thing that they either celebrate or continue to have to kind of be very mindful of along the way. And then obviously there's a separate world, which is the so that's all to do with kind of having a public facing voice. And then when it comes to kind of almost a private facing voice around business leaders, politicians, or in my world, directors, there is still quite a significant inequity. There is a real problem with female directors in our industry across the board, which generations of people are trying to solve. You know, you get a lot of female production teams, so production managers, production coordinators, etc., because it's like, well, the organizing roles and the kind of planning roles, they're for the women, and then the kind of creative direction roles, they're for the men. That continues to be persuasive within the industry. I think from my point of view, and where we're working as a business, and actually where we've seen a lot of success, is that because we're a small business, and because we've been born in a more recent times, we actually have found lots of benefits into leaning into a female experience. And that goes all the way up to the conversations around maternity and people returning to work. Some people wanting to do part-time because they've got children. They want to kind of balance their motherhood alongside their career as well, which I think has always been a discussion as part of women in the workplace. And actually for us, we found that to be a massive benefit. So our team at one point, I did a quick count, and the team that I had were kind of 80 to 85% female. And that wasn't by design. That's literally because we were advertising lots of part-time roles, because that's the only way that we could make our business viable when we were starting out. And those roles were attracting a lot of people that were either returning to work or more interested in part-time work. And in addition to that, and then the result of that is that that's helped our business grow, because we've actually won a lot of work doing parenting programming. So we're working with the BBC at the moment on Tiny Happy People, which is a big parenting proposal that the BBC are doing. We're currently working on some branded content with Cow and Gate. And I think that it's not by design. It was never in the business plan that we were going to be the premier parenting production company. But along the way, with the team that we've developed and the fact that this space is growing in content and revenue and money and distribution. All of those things have kind of come together to kind of help us grow as a business. And so, we're finding advantages in it, but I think that there is still certainly different challenges along the way. And one of the key ones for us is, who is it that is telling the stories, not just in front of the camera, but also behind the camera also.
Thanks, Faraz. That's great. And I'm so happy that we're already putting our heads together and thinking about solutions from our different perspectives, because that's why sessions like this can be really valuable, bringing people together from these different spheres. Ruth, did you have any responses to the findings or to what Michelle's just shared?
Hi, yeah, I mean, I would add to Faraz's point that it is, it is disappointing to see that we're still at this position in terms of attracting women into positions of power. And I think there's a sort of, it's really interesting to see the different sort of aspects of what you think is contributing to that. And in looking through your executive summary, I sort of grouped a couple of things together because I think that they maybe you need to think about them in a slightly different kind of, in policy terms, in a slightly different way. So the first one that I thought was really striking was that girls think women in the public eye are under constant and hostile scrutiny. And I think sort of unpacking that is really very complex because, it's part of a kind of wider culture that exists. It's about the media environment in totality. But when you start breaking that down, there are multiple facets involved. So you've got kind of traditional media and representations within that. But you've also got sort of, I think, the harder space, I think, of online and social media, which is, in sort of regulatory terms, much less kind of regulated space. And we're only just getting to a point where we're thinking, in fact, in the Queen's speech just today, the online safety bill is being announced, and that will bring in for the first time some regulation around user-generated content. It's, the start of what is likely to be a sort of ongoing, I think, kind of discourse around how you deal with the kind of online space. I think there has been some positive things but potentially positive things in the last little bit. I think, the fact that Trump was shut down in some respects has been very positive. I think you have to be really careful, though. The tech companies took that as sort of, a direct action and decided to do that. But I think that they had good reason for being reticent about taking that decision, because, of course, when you start having this conversation, you have to think about freedom of expression and sort of who are the right sort of gatekeepers of what is and is not sort of allowed to be discussed. So that's, and certainly in sort of, when we're thinking about policy in government, we're always trying to balance those two things together so that we don't sort of, the unintended consequences are sort of considered when we're thinking about that kind of regulatory space. So that I thought was really interesting, and sort of, what you do to try and directly intervene, if you like. And there's a role there, I think, for business and for the tech companies and other media producers themselves. But and governments there to step in, I think, when things aren't looking like they're happening, and so that's interesting. And then at the other end of sort of your exec summary, you talk about girls think experience is as important as role models, but have limited opportunities for decision making. And then your sort of leadership is seen as the preserve of the privileged. And I think a lot of that has to do with people, you mentioned, Michelle, if you see it, you can be it. And I think that is so important. And sort of back to kind of Faraz's point, I think another kind of key area you have to really think about in trying to shift the culture is getting people in the decision-making roles. And that means behind the camera, behind the scenes, not just in front of it. And I've got a kind of interesting stat that I picked out. Apparently, according to the stats that we have available to us, their BAME representation last year on screen was around 25%, but off screen, 8.6%. So there's a big gap. I mean, there's more to do in terms of on-screen representation, but it's really striking that the off-screen, the kind of decision makers, the commissioners, the directors, and so on and so forth we're quite a way behind, I think, in terms of and dealing with that. So I just thought, media representation, sort of I guess, kind of representation of women in the decision-making roles, and sort of taking down the barriers for them to get to that at the one end, and then sort of how do we, for want of a better word, kind of police or regulate the media space and the media landscape at the other, just were two things that really kind of stuck out for me.
Thank you. Yeah, so there's representation in both its meanings, in terms of who's in the room, and then how things are represented, as in, you know, what representation gets created as a result. And interestingly, from both perspectives, this question of recognizing the power of the gatekeepers, whether that's regulatory or whether that's, you know, recognizing that you are a gatekeeper if you have a kind of a role with creative agency in the making of, you know, pretty much anything. That this question of who's gatekeeping is really, really important. Michele, we had some recommendations from our findings, didn't we? Actions that we hoped to be able to make, and we've been talking to the Jo Cox Foundation about ways we might do some of those. I was wondering if you could talk through some of our suggested recommendations, and then whether Faraz and Ruth, you could talk about, you know, how we might collaborate outside of our field to make some of that kind of thing happen, and whether you think that there are other things there that we should be thinking of.
Yes, certainly. I mean, as you mentioned, there are several threads. One of the things we've been talking to the Jo Cox Foundation about is the possibility of a leadership curriculum in schools, or rather we call it a decision-making curriculum, because part of the problem is some of the language around leadership and its kind of Churchillian overtones in this country at the moment. And also working again with youth groups like the WAGs to get something that I'm just going to park that for a minute, because I think we're more about in the creative industries here. And first of all, I just wanted to recognise what both Faraz and Ruth had said. We're not talking here about stereotypes that are created by the media. Stereotypes aren't a media invention. They're a form of psychological shorthand. If you put a stereotype on your front page, that's the instant hit of recognition. People don't have to work to recognise it. However, one thing we do know about the media is, number one, media in general, and I do, if I were my own student, I'd be saying don't generalise, but do tend to follow rather than to create stereotypes. Their role is more reinforcement, just across the board. However, I suppose we
both shape and reflect the society that we're in.
However, they can shift the boat and shift the direction. And I think this is very difficult. For the same reason it's possible, is that most of our legislation, to go to Ruth, is based on the idea of harm or offence. Harm is really difficult to prove. I mean, there's a report come out now from the BBC, does social media harm adolescent mental health? It's really hard to pick the media out of everything else that's going on. And offence is taken as what would be offensive to the ordinary. It actually says, I think in the original legislation, man in the street, which says something. So something that might offend me on gender grounds, you might be absolutely fine with. So those notions, any legislation has to be tied to those, and I think have to take the public with them. Now, I think for a long time, issues around stereotyping of disabled people carried the public with them. Issues around the some aspects of racial stereotyping, though by no means all, carried the public with them, and there was and has been legislation. I think issues around hate speech of misogyny are trying to deal with some of those. So that's the kind of background. The thing that got me excited, actually, a while back, I've also been doing some work based on mine and Hannah's research with the Intersectional Feminist Foreign Policy Group, who are interested in developing social models for leadership, talking about stereotyping. And somebody, and that's run by Shaista Aziz, who works for the BBC and Al Jazeera, and was co-chair of the Fawcett Society, just if you wanted to follow her up and get in touch, anybody. And they introduced me to the World Health Organization's 19-point surgery checklist. Now, what on earth has that got to do with it? There was a world problem that people were dying or staying very ill after surgery as a result of the surgery, because swabs have been left in or cuts have been made or something, you know. So they developed a 19-point checklist, and it's really simple, like clean your tools, count your swabs, you know, and everybody follows it now, almost in every hospital in the world. And that got me quite excited to think there could be a really easy checklist. It wouldn't cover everything, but that kind of sense of turning the stereotype Titanic. And something that's already done that, and am I allowed to read something aloud, Hannah? It's very short. This is from the Sex and Power report on Who Runs Britain by the Fawcett Society in 2015. And they have 5 recommendations, and the 5th one is for the media, and it's called An Equal Voice. And it says, we call upon the media to ensure that their coverage of political issues includes women in their views, treats all contributors with the dignity and respect to which they're entitled, and accords with the code of conduct published by the NUJ. So we know that the rules are already there. Editors and broadcasters should take responsibility for commissioning contributions from both women and men as commentators and experts. And I think the dearth of expertise, particularly older expertise, I think of Mary Beard immediately and the horrible time she has online. Women and commentators as experts, broadcasters and event organisers and audiences, so that's us too, should challenge parties which always put up male speakers. Now, there is a whole thing on Twitter for academics, which is anti what they're called manels, which are all male panels. All organisations, public, private and third sector, should take steps to ensure that at meetings and events, both men and women appear on platforms as speakers. We encourage individual citizens to object to men-only platforms, panels and programmes. So that's a kind of an overarching thing. And I just thought, what if we had the equivalent of a WHO checklist? Now, obviously, I don't work in media, I'm an academic. It's really easy for me to get pronouncey about this. What if we said, could we please not, when men and women do that, mention the woman's age, unless it's appropriate to the story, mention her appearance, unless it's appropriate to the story, give any domestic details. Now, I love our local paper. We're lucky to still have one. Very few towns have them. We had 4 police commissioners, 3 men, 1 woman. Guess which one cited her age and whether she was a parent? Only for the woman. This, that checklist would stop that. Is there a gendered vocabulary? Do we talk about, for example, people kept saying about Annalisa Dodds, is she steely enough? It's just, men don't get questioned on their steeliness. Can we please avoid using nicknames like Mutti Merkel and Auntie Jacinda? Very easy ones. And if we are aware, now we all use stereotypes. There's psychological shorthand for all of us, whether we've done bias training aware of them. But if they seem to be obvious, can we just have a quick check? So that's just 6 points: age, appearance, domestic details, vocabulary, nicknames and stereotypes. That would seem to be a bit of an easy win for me. Just a checklist, an editorial checklist. So that was the recommendation that Hannah and I have been talking about at the moment. But as I said, we're not in the industry, and I'm always very loath to, it's like when people tell me how to lecture, I think.
I still feel like I'm, connected. I should say that I was for 12 years.
Yes, that's true, actually, in a way that I'm not. So these are my feelings of having a bit of a cheek putting them to you. But I feel, again, looking at that, the day that I wrote the executive summary, when we'd been through all our data, that I had Radio 4 on in the background, and the presenter was saying, so Theresa May's gone to Europe and shown a bit of leg. And it's endemic. A checklist could stop it in the same way that the WHO's checklist could stop the swab being left in the wound. This seemed to me to be a step.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. So yeah, those are some of the recommendations that we've been working on. Faraz and Ruth, what do you think? And do you think that there should be others?
I think that, so part of this conversation is about intersectionality, and I think we've already kind of mentioned it as part of this. I think Ruth, that is really interesting about kind of on screen and off screen. And I just want to obviously, I always bring my own otherness into this. You may or may not have noticed, but I'm an Asian male. And so when we're talking about race, which is something that Ruth mentioned, actually there is a continuing issue and a thing that I started talking about, which is this kind of lumping together of non-whiteness, which is kind of proving to be quite problematic. So, we have made strides in Black representation on screen, but when it comes to Asian representation, there are no Asian, for instance, there are no Asian radio presenters on Radio 1. I think that there's none on Radio 2. There's none on radio. I think there's one on Radio 3. And if the same was true with Black presenters or female presenters, there would be an absolute outrage. But because we've got the Asian network, the Asian people are over there, they're done. We don't need to worry about them. And there continues to be a problem with how we all kind of like just lump everybody together and otherness together as well. So you look at someone like Beyonce or Michelle Obama, they've ticked all the boxes. Great, let's put them on the front cover of a magazine and we're done for the next few months. And I think intersectionality, particularly with the younger generation, is becoming more and more of a touch point. The other thing I kind of feel like is important to note is what I would class as a fetishization of leadership, like this sense that everyone needs to be a leader, and if you're not a leader, you've not succeeded, which I think is really problematic. I think that there are people that do want to be leaders, and there are people that want to play part of a team, and we shouldn't kind of hero one over the other. I think we need to make sure that there's access to those who do want to become leaders to be able to attain that level. But I think we also need to make sure that we're not pushing people to kind of go, you must be a leader if you want to represent your community. I don't necessarily agree with that being the instant solution. And part of that is how we operate when we put together teams. And we've had lots of experiences because of the way that production works. You put together teams for short periods of time, and then it dissipate kind of later once you finish the production. You know, I remember I was on location once, and we had a female piece of talent that was on camera for us, and I walked into the studio and realised that everyone behind the camera was male. And so I spoke to my business partner, who was female. She's my director of production, our director of production. And we're like, we just can't make sure that doesn't happen again. So there's like just acknowledging it and being aware of it as a man is like our responsibility. This isn't something that, as Michele mentioned earlier, this isn't something that we can just kind of go, well, it's a women's issue and they need to solve it themselves. That's never going to work. That's not going to be an issue. It's people who are in leadership roles, who are men, identifying their problems, and seeing problems like having an all-male production team and making sure that you put in processes in the future, not necessarily to get female leadership in play, but to make sure that the representation across all different teams is as diverse as it can possibly be. And we've seen that succeed. So we worked on we produced a CBeebies show, so for under fours, called What's on Your Head, which was born out of a brief around diversity. And it was a very simple premise of an idea where we had lots of people from different worlds who all wear things on their heads for different reasons. So Sikh turban wearers, firefighters with firefighter helmets on, lawyers with barrister wigs on, hijab, Muslims with hijabs on.
I need you to know that my son adores this program.
And Basement Jaxx did the theme tune, which is one of my favorite things. But when we were casting that show, and again, this wasn't by design, it wasn't in the brief, it's not something the BBC asked us to do, it happened organically because of the sort of people that we had as part of the team. If you watch that show, the barrister that we have on that show is mixed race, she's Essex, and she's a female, which means that for the majority of people watching that show, the first time that they see a barrister and a barrister's wig, it will be on the head of a mixed race female from Essex and not from on the head of an old white man. So automatically, we are from a very early age hoping that we're going to kind of subvert those stereotypes. And that's why kind of children's programming is really important and interesting, and why I'm always drawn to it as a solution. And again, that's across the board. The firefighter we have, female, black, short, she's a short black female and she's a firefighter. Again, it's probably the first firefighter that will be speaking to children at that age that they will hear a voice from, and automatically will mean that they will associate that look with that position. Our Sikh was a model, our hijab wearer was a sports person. All along the way, by doing those things in our casting, we recognize that it is important to how we kind of frame the conversation about who has those roles, what they do, and hopefully will then start kind of permeating into public consciousness and start kind of just poking at those stereotypes that we kind of mentioned earlier. And I think that's a responsibility of who we are as a production company. And then just lastly, I kind of wanted to mention Noel Clark, because I think that also, you may have seen in the news about Noel kind of having, there's been many allegations that have come against him, and it's kind of caused kind of real earthquakes within the industry. What's been particularly interesting about that is, the chase to represent young black men in a positive way that BAFTA had led to them getting into the situation that we're in now. And I absolutely agree with how we need to be very careful in how we speak about women, and again, use their femininity as part of the criticisms that we have for them. But I do think that the lessons that we're starting to learn from that crisis that's happening very, very in the moment is that we do need to make sure that we are able to hold women to account for wrongdoing. And, you know, there are times when, you know, when you have politicians, when you have leadership, when you have business leaders, women make mistakes and they do things that they shouldn't be doing. And we can't get into a situation where we can't feel like we can criticize women, not because they are women, but because of the things that they have done along the way. And I think that when we look at the scandal around Noel Clark, the fact that nobody was feeling like they could come and speak out about some of the reprehensible things he was doing because he was a young black man demonstrates that actually there may be problems in making sure that we are getting to a situation where we can criticize women, but not automatically go to their appearance as a way of doing that. And finding the kind of way that we can do that is going to be an important step forward in how we can make sure we represent people correctly.
I think that speaks to some of the wider issues we have in just the polarization of debate at the moment, that someone is, and the tribalism in our kind of public discourse, that, you know, it's a full cancelling or it's vehement support, but there isn't, you know, we need public discourse that has capacity to critique and engage with nuance and be simultaneously anti-racist and, you know, and holding people to account, as you say. On the question of who, you know, the kind of mandate that everybody must want to be a leader, we did our research amongst 50 girls in state schools around the country, and then we're going to expand that, looking into fee-paying schools and expanding it intersectionally, actively trying to access. Yes, so do you want to talk here, Michele?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I don't want to cut down on Ruth's time, but actually the big part of the research that we've recently published on but haven't brought in here is actually girls pushing back against that idea of the individual leader, both because they I think that kind of idea of doing stuff collectively feels fairer to them, but also because they feel more protected if they're not being, you know, so this idea, this is why we're trying to use a vocabulary more of decision making rather than leadership, because leadership implies a kind of state of being, a look at me, I'm in the middle, whereas decision making, some decisions are made by leaders, but actually even where you have a leader, like Boris Johnson or Keir Starmer, there is a process of decision making that leads to that, and actually making that less mystified and giving girls experience in it, we felt was really important. This, I'll find the link to our article about individualism. Sorry, it's a little bit academic, but we're working on blogging the less academic versions, the one around individualism versus group decision making and their desire for that.
Thanks, Michele. And the other thing I wanted to say was that there was a real reluctance to identify the experience that they had as leadership amongst the state school girls. But then we've started going into fee-paying schools, and there is not that reticence at all. So when you say we have to be, you know, not everybody needs to be a leader. Well, some people are more coached to put themselves forward, you know, by the time they've left school, for example, than others. So we do need to do something to redress or to balance, to, you know, to encourage, to make sure that the encouragement is equally, you know, distributed or available. Okay, Ruth, did you want to respond to our recommendations and add your own and tell us, you know, what we should be doing, and also how we might be, you know, best collaborating? And then after that, I'll take any questions from if they've been written into the chat box.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting conversation up to now. I mean, I would, you know, I think your first kind of comment there, Michele, about leadership and decision making and sort of pushing this into the curriculum is absolutely key. I think, you know, it's sort of those early interventions that are so important in really affecting what girls' aspirations are right from the get-go. And I think that goes right the way down to kind of the early years, kind of television, children's television, and the representation that you see there is all really kind of shaping, I think, you know, the identity of our girls. And I was sort of doing a little bit of looking around and research in the run up to this, and interesting. I don't know if you've come across the Aspire program, which is actually looking at barriers to entry for STEM for girls, and it's just so interesting looking at what they talk about there, and in particular that actually girls quite often will have by the age of about 10, they will often have a quite fixed idea about what they want to do in their lives, and that doesn't change massively until they're 19. So actually that's sort of really early intervention and what's happening in the earlier years. So not just concentrating on sort of teens, but also thinking about what's going on in the run up to that seems important. But the other thing they talk about in that research is the leaky pipeline, so that there are several kind of points in the pipeline for, and this was in this, in terms of the pipeline for science careers for girls, and that you lose girls at every point in this pipeline. And the first point is sort of the point where you jump off from school into uni and so on and so forth. But that there are several others as you get through and into careers. And Faraz mentioned a few of them about sort of balancing family life and so on and so forth. So I think addressing some of those things is so important. But those stereotypes and what you see on screen, what you see in the media, really do make an impact early on. The other thing that I thought was interesting was around your checklist, which I think is a really kind of positive idea. And I think the thing that I would kind of be thinking about there is sort of how do you kind of absolutely force the public debate on this issue? Because how do you make kind of not the ones that are going to do it easily and sort of tick it off because that just fits with their sort of broader culture, if you like. But if you think of some of the kind of, I don't know, some parts of the press that might not be as sort of willing to just sort of sign up to something like that. And also actually, the other thing that I think is really interesting is that, media we're right on the cusp of this massive globalization of media. And, we look at kind of some of the levers that government have are about the UK and the UK media landscape, but actually increasingly, particularly young people are really not engaging, engaging much less on television. They're probably not engaging so much on, sort of with newspapers and so on. They are 100% online, and that's global. And sort of how do you win the battle with those global players to make them listen? Sort of what are the things you can do to really keep the public debate in play? So is it kind of using your talents, the front of camera people, to absolutely put the pressure on? I think there's a role for that. It's also background to this idea of getting a sort of decision makers up, helped up into the really senior echelons of these companies, so that it's women thinking about these policies and saying, actually, I think we need to change this, and having the perspective, and not just women, but we've talked about kind of intersectionality, and that's really important too. So it's unfortunately it's kind of a difficult circle, because you need to get them there in the first place to make the change, but getting them there is a struggle. So it's sort of, how do you address it through thinking about the leaky pipeline? How do you address the barriers at each stage? And I think there are slightly different policy responses at those different points.
Thanks, Ruth. I think I wish that we had so much more time. I feel like there's so much we could do, especially when we start to talk about how we could collaborate, or how people can collaborate outside of their sphere. But one thing that's really coming across is that this is such a multifaceted issue. We talk about the stories that are being told, by whom, in front of the camera, behind the camera, locally, globally, and all of that question of how to get talent progressing throughout. There's so, even when we talk about the media, we've got so many aspects within that, whether it's traditional legacy broadcast and so forth, or social media. It's just there's a lot to do, isn't there? I'm going to now start taking some questions from the audience, but I hope that we'll be able to get together again some way, somehow, and do more. So hold on one second while I open up audience questions. And to the audience, I'm really sorry if we don't get through all of them. Okay, so question first here is, what do you see as the role of higher ed? So we've talked about what happens in school, in education. What do we see as the role of higher education in encouraging both? Because we create both, the workers of the future, and so we need to encourage both their representation and diversity of that pipeline going in, but also the professionalization of that new talent coming into the sector. So what do we see as our role in higher education in those two aspects when it comes to gender equality in the creative industries, and of course, including race, class, gender expression, and so forth?
So I think that this is probably the time. Oh, am I muted? I'm not muted. This is probably the time that me, Hannah, and Ruth make a confession in the fact that we all went to the same higher education establishment, and that's how we know each other. And I think actually this is kind of part of it. Is creating networks is actually one of the key parts of higher education. It's not on the curriculum. You obviously can't tell people you must go and be friends with these people along the way. But I think that actually what we've seen, and what I've particularly seen running a business, is that when you are able to, a lot of this is about networks, the speed that you have to move to get access to people, talent, as well as contributors and on-screen talent. A lot of it is done via personal connections. And so, the more that we can do at an earlier age in higher education establishments to make sure that people are making the most of their networks and not kind of going, everyone is coming out of an education as a kind of a graduate of Oxford Brookes, and that is who they are, but actually coming out of education as an individual, and they can all provide different resources along the way to help build kind of better teams moving forward. That's what I'm always advocating for whenever I'm speaking to universities and colleges. It's not just about, right, go to university, learn how to become a director, and then like, if you are a director from Oxford Brookes, you're automatically going to get a job here. That's not how it works. The way it works is that we're going to higher education establishments to kind of really build critical thinking so that we can gain a whole level of different groups and minds coming together, but allow them to kind of build teams that understand how each other's thinking, but also understand that they can provide things as an individual or seek out some of the things that they're missing to put together the best teams. And I think that's to me is always key when it comes to higher ed.
There's music to my ears, Faraz, because there's so much talk in this kind of employability agenda now that is really objectifies what one gets out of a degree. And yes, for us, it's always that critical thinking that we're really trying to inculcate first and foremost. And then, that can spread into whatever professionalized skills are being.
I would add that, and this is something that I think, the creative industries, rightly get slated for, over the years, is that, there has been a history of unpaid internships in creative industries careers at the kind of entry level. And actually that probably needs to change significantly to enable a much broader range of people to enter into it. One thing I would say is that something I've just started doing, which I'm really enjoying, is I'm a mentor for my old university, and it's on a kind of diversity scheme, and I'm helping students to navigate what they might do after they leave university, as well as thinking about the kind of networks they might want to build depending on what they want to do. And I think schemes like that, actually, just as a kind of very personal thing that I just happen to be involved in at the moment, are really beneficial. And they weren't around, I don't think, so much, certainly when I was coming through university, and it's really positive to see that they are now.
Go, Michelle.
Yeah, I would absolutely endorse what both of you have said, and that is not to suggest as well that universities are places where the student experience of gender relations are positive. We've seen across universities across the land, there's a lot of bad stuff going on for young people.
Yeah, I mean, the data shows it's one of the first places that they experienced sexual harassment or assault.
So that aside, I was very interested in what you were saying about the mentoring, because that's helpful. There's a young woman who was at Exeter, I think, who started the 93% Club, because to represent the 93% of people who didn't go to private schools, and it sets up an alternative network. And the reason I'm interested in that is not just the network in itself, though I think that is wonderful. It's spread to lots of other universities, is that one of the things that just Hannah and I kept coming back and back to is the less privileged girls, it's all mystique. They don't have parents in the kinds of jobs they aspire to. They don't know people. You know, the female lead books are saying develop a network. They don't know how, they don't know anybody. It's actually exposing the importance of those and how they operate and how to make them, you know, how to make them work. And the reason I love that 93%, because it's not about trying to break into somebody else's world. It's, hey, we've already got this. We can do this for ourselves. So I think, you know, we talk about networking, and in some ways it makes you cringe. It reminds you of every academic conference when you've just passed your PhD and you'd be standing with a glass of wine, desperately trying to talk to the important researchers in the room and just wanting to be at home. But there's the other side of network, which is about having the exciting ideas with people who are on the same page that you are on. And I think facilitating that and doing that kind of mentoring, we've had some really great people come and mentor our students, Ruth. So I think, yes, that is absolutely one of the ways forward.
And we had a great panel about the power of mentoring in building a more equal creative industries last week, and that will be available online, as will everything. Hopefully be available online next month. Okay, next question. I'm going to combine two questions. And they're both talking about intersectional diversity in different ways. The first is about how to platform the voices of young women from the Northeast region, or more broadly, just outside of those kind of concentrated centres of London, Manchester, and so forth. And then there's another question that's been asked about what about neurodiverse representation and how this links into gender. So I'm going to start with those two, but also invite you to expand from that, how we engage with this question of greater equality intersectionally.
I think from a regional point of view, there is a massive push, particularly in the TV industry, to kind of get better regional representation. I don't think it's any secret that Brexit has terrified broadcasters in a way that they just didn't see it coming, particularly with the BBC. And there have been great strides, both with the new Director General at the BBC and the current move to regionalise Channel 4 to kind of protect its own future, that hopefully will mean that we will get to see more regional voices. We are actively looking for regional stories because, number one, it's more interesting, and number two, it's leading to better work at the moment. So I think we are starting to see a kind of real sea change in that space. Also, they rate better as well. When you have TV stories that are outside of London, they seem to be doing better in the ratings, and I think everyone's woken up to that. So I think that we are going to get to see more regional representation across the UK coming. It's happening now, and I think it will continue to happen moving forward. I think that when it comes to kind of, again, around intersectionality and, you know, gender and race and all of those things, I think that there is a lot to be said about, you know, what's been mentioned earlier about, you know, you need to see it to be it. But my sense and what we're trying to do as a company is to kind of create it more authentically. I think that there is still a kind of sense of, you know, you need to look at your spreadsheet and make sure that you've ticked the right numbers against the right things. And obviously that needs to be done for reporting, and that will make sense. But this will only ever change once organically teams from lots of different places have come together. And I really strongly believe that, like, there is no point in putting together a production team or a storytelling team that are all telling exactly the same story, because you may as well just have hired one person to tell that story. Why are you hiring all the same people with the same experiences as part of a team? You're not going to get any point of difference along the way. And there is a real creative benefit in having lots of different people, giving them a voice in a room. They don't necessarily have to be leaders, but getting the leaders to delegate the voice to those people so that they can all speak about their experiences, because it makes a creative product better in the end, and in particular in television. I would hope, I mean, we've woken up to it, and I would hope that more people are waking up to it further down the line. So it's, you know, from a business point of view, we're looking at it being business led, but if we don't get it right, I'm sure that people like Ruth will be knocking at my door, making sure that, like, we do a better job of it moving forward.
Okay, I'm going to let Ruth and Michelle respond to this question, and I'm going to wrap it up there. And I'm really sorry I've seen that there was a raised hand that I couldn't get to, and there's a couple more. I'll summarise what the remaining questions were at the end, but we won't have time to cover them all.
Yeah, I mean, I would just, you know, 100% agree, I think, with Faraz on the kind of there's a shift, I think, in terms of recognising the need for that kind of regional representation. It's certainly something that is a kind of broader theme. I think you probably see it within government in terms of moving sort of spending, I suppose, and focus outside of London. And I mean, this is just a kind of, I don't know, this is an observation which is a parallel observation in a way, but I think that sort of coming out of the pandemic is a great opportunity, actually, because, there's, I don't think people are going to have to be situated in London and so London-centric going forward, because it's, we've proven that we can do a lot of this kind of work online. So I think actually that naturally gives a kind of springboard, which I hope will mean that there is just this much more balanced kind of approach going forward.
Michele, do you want to finish by sharing, because these things absolutely came up in our research, didn't they? Regional exclusion, and also we have plans to look at neurodiversity
and by
too.
Regional, actually, a lot of what we mean is class and the intersection of class with other forms of exclusion. And it comes back to what Faraz was saying about it's not just an issue of counting numbers and checking boxes, that assumption of kind of trickle down diversity, trickle down feminism, that if you have a woman leader of a company, you've checked that board, then automatically conditions will improve for other women. That if you have a woman in that drama show or doing a lot of tweets for that department, we cannot assume that if we have a commitment to equal representation because we're aware of its importance, then that must include addressing. I said regionality because regionality is a thing. And I know BBC's moved to Salford and Channel 4 does apprenticeships for excluded groups. But I also think the one thing we've talked a lot about women, but that one of the biggest things that emerged from the girls was we don't just feel excluded because we're girls, we feel excluded for all kinds of other reasons. And being actually female wasn't always necessarily the biggest one. So.
That's really interesting. Okay, so just to summarise the remaining questions, so Faraz has kindly answered in the comments for someone was asking for what they can give their daughter as a parent, their teenage daughter as a parent, and he's recommended Screen Skills as a place with great resources. And also there was a really interesting question about the issues of representing diversity without actually that being representative of the truth of what's happening behind the scenes. So again, this back to this question that it's multifaceted. You can address the diversity on screen, but if that is not indicative of genuine inclusion from that level all the way down, then is that helpful? Is that misleading? Is that a kind of fig leaf and an alibi for not addressing the problem? Yes, Michele, very quickly, we're 4 minutes over, super fast.
Representation of minorities, again, if you only employ one figure on the grounds of diversity, they can enter a place or a classroom or a discussion feeling they carry the weight of representing everything about being a woman. Yeah. Or being a Muslim woman, or being a working class person. So that's another reason not to just base it on figureheads.
Yes, invite people to participate with absolutely no expectation that they are representing a community. As Stuart Hall calls it, the burden of representation. Okay, we've run over. I'm sorry, ill-disciplined chair, but it's because it was so interesting and it could have gone on. I just feel like this conversation could have gone on for hours. I've loved it. Thank you all for coming. Thank you so much to our speakers. I'm definitely going to be harassing you more in the future to do more with this. Please come to all the other events in the Creative Industries Festival and come and please, fill in our feedback form and say how great we are. Thank you.